Modern monetary theory, MMT, first of all, it's well over 100 years old, maybe 140 years old.
Okay.
So there's nothing particularly modern about it. It goes by another name, chartalism, but it's the same thing. Money is what the state says it is. If the state says it's money, it's money. I think, okay, interesting. How do you actually enforce that? How do you back that up? And the way you back it up is taxation. So if we all make money, gains, payments, income, whatever, and the state says you got to pay tax on it. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we will only accept our definition of money in the form of taxes. So if you don't go along with our definition of money, you can't pay your taxes. And if you can't pay your taxes, you end up in jail. But the idea is that money is what the state says it is, because the state says that's the only thing we take in the form of taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, we'll put you in jail. Now, and that's where chartalism comes from, because the King's Charter or the Queen's Charter or whatever. So if that's your starting place, then there's no comparison between a national budget and an individual budget. If you and I don't pay our bills, someone's going to repossess the car, or mm-hmm. take the keys to the house or whatever. So we got to balance our budgets over some time frame. But if the government doesn't pay its bills, so what? Just print some more money, and or raise money in the form of bonds. And then you say, well, what if they don't want to buy the bonds? If the market doesn't want to buy the bonds and the interest rates are up? Well, that's what central banks are for. The central bank will buy the bonds, keep the rates low. Oh, yeah, but who's going to pay the central bank? Well, we'll just issue more. Now, I realize some of this sounds laughable, but I'm telling you verbatim, this is what modern monetary theory is. So there's no limit on how much you can spend, no limit on the size of your deficit. Danielle referred to the debt to GDP ratio. I agree, that's a very important economic indicator, but the modern monetary theorists will say, no, it's not. Who cares? U.S. debt to GDP ratio is about 130%, but it's growing quickly. And if you look at global statistics, you say, well, who's at that lunch table? Like, who else is around 130%? The answer is Lebanon, Greece, mm-hmm. Italy. These are your classmates. But then everyone points to Japan, where the ratio of Japan is about 280%. They say, see, Japan, you go to the Ginza, the lights are still on. Yeah. So we could go to 280% or whatever, no problem. I think Japan's a special case for a number of reasons, and I wouldn't want to be Japan. They're in a curious position where the population is declining. So their per capita numbers are actually better than their gross numbers. And Saki Kibara-san, famous Mr. Yen of the 1980s, he explained this to me personally. I had lunch with him in Korea. And of course he's right mathematically. I said, but the reductio ad absurdum is Japan ends up with one person who owns the whole country, and she's very rich. But that's kind of how the Japanese are thinking about it. So I don't know if we want to go there. But just to take it a step further, and a lot of this comes from Stephanie Kelton, and I met Stephanie, very nice person, but she's just way off on off the reservation, so to speak, in terms of these theories. But she's done a good job of articulating them. So, for example, she says, and this is from her book, so this is not I'm not imposing this on her. She says that the government bond market is a favor to investors. We're doing you a favor by giving you something you can invest in. We don't actually need a government bond market, because we could just give the Fed wire instructions to Lockheed. And if we want to buy a new fighter aircraft, or Raytheon, or whoever is providing services to the government, or the Social Security Administration for that matter, the Fed could just wire the money directly to these government vendors. Who needs a bond market? It's kind of an inefficient pain in the neck. But we do it anyway, because you guys need a place to park your money. I mean, this is what they say. Wow. And so, but just to kind of step back a little bit, big picture, what they're doing, and this can be done in practice. See, the problem with refuting modern monetary theory is you get very far down the road saying, yeah, that's actually true, that's actually true, that's actually true. At the end, it all falls down. But they go very far down a path, because the truth is you could give the Fed wire instructions, and they could send money to Lockheed. You could issue twice as much debt. I mean, there's a debt ceiling, but Congress routinely raises it. But what she's done, and what the other theorists have done, they've taken the Treasury, which is a cabinet-level executive branch office, and the Fed, which is an independent, privately owned. The president picks the governors, but technically privately owned, independent agency, and she's merged them. She's merged the balance sheet of the Treasury and the Fed. Said whatever the Treasury wants to spend, the Fed is there to finance it. Mm-hmm. The Fed can buy the bonds, or we can skip the bonds completely and just give the Fed wire instructions and send the money out. Now, this is what they say. This is not me. So And then you say, well, okay, I don't see what's wrong with that. I mean, it sounds, legally, I'm a lawyer also, this is all true. It can be done in practice. I guess that's my point, regardless of the legalities. So where does it all fall down? A couple things. Number one, the theorists completely ignore the role of commercial banks. They're so focused on the Fed and the Treasury. Real money, the money that counts, is created by commercial banks, not by the Fed. Pardon me, the Fed, when they create base money, that's available to banks as reserves, but there's no shortage of reserves right now. They're paying interest on excess reserves.
Right.
Most of the Fed's balance sheet is not cash, it's excess reserves. So there's no constraint on banks' ability to lend or borrowers' ability to borrow money and spend. That can be constrained by reserves in theory, but it's not, because they have trillions in excess reserves.
Okay.
So that's not even an issue. But but the money's created at the banks. If people don't want to borrow and banks don't want to lend, then the M2 and M1 and M2 don't expand. And then velocity, which is the turnover of money, is collapsing. It's up a little bit recently, but that's after a Red Bull cliff dive in 2020. And that's, I always say, if you have $24 trillion, and times zero is zero.
Right.
Meaning if that's your money supply and your velocity is zero, you don't have an economy. So velocity is psychological. The Fed can't control it. There are all kinds of behavioral aspects. The real money that kind of creates economic activity doesn't come from the Fed. It comes from the commercial banks. They ignore the commercial banks, and then on top of everything else, they ignore foreign exchange channels. You can destroy the dollar. Like, everything inside the United States can kind of look okay. But if the dollar is like, it's worth, €5 or sorry, $5 to the euro, so, it's worth 20% of what it is now. Every other currency strengthens against the dollar, or gold goes to $4,000 an ounce almost overnight. What you've done, you've devalued the dollar 80–90%, which is what we did in the 70s. Measured in gold, you go from $35 an ounce to $800 an ounce. That's a 90% devaluation of the dollar, measured in gold. And we actually had a 50% devaluation of the dollar between 77 and 81, measured by CPI. So this has happened before, not that long ago. So they're on a path to destroy the dollar. They're on a path to destroy the international monetary system. Here we are in Bretton Woods, where it all began. But governments may be back here trying to fix things sooner than later. So now, I doubt there are 5 members of Congress who could give you a tenth of what I just said about modern monetary theory. Right. But they're doing it. Whether they know it or not, whether they understand it and can define it or not, it doesn't matter. They're doing it. These multi-trillion-dollar, year-after-year deficits, debt to GDP going past 130%, unlimited bond and issuance, monetization by the Fed or the commercial banks, they're playing it out. So this will end in something a lot worse than a recession.
Why are those residential real estate prices going up? And the same thing's happening in the United States. The answer is that there is an exodus, and I don't think that's too strong a word, out of the cities. People are put off by, cities have always been a trade-off. Cities are, okay, you have a lot of noise and some dirt and some hassles and maybe a slightly higher crime rate. But on the other hand, you have art and culture and museums and shows and restaurants and bars. And so you make the trade-off. You say, I'll accept these annoyances in exchange for all this, culture and buzz. And cities attract, the brightest people. So whether it's, bankers or lawyers or doctors or artists, playwrights, actors, whatever. It's just, there's a lot of buzz. That's why people go to cities. With these lockdowns, we've amplified all the negatives and taken away all the positives. We've shut the museums, the restaurants, the bars, the plays, the office buildings, things that attracted people. But meanwhile, again, probably not as bad in Australia as it is here, but crime is on the rise. Murder rate in New York has doubled. Suicide rates across the country have tripled. And that's New York, the suicide rate's national. There are all these dysfunctions, and a lot of them, and of course, when you have highly concentrated populations, which you do in cities, a lot of that's worse. So what people are doing, I say people, it's the people who can afford it. They're getting out of the cities and they're going to nearby suburbs or even further out, what we call exurbs, which are, the next ring beyond the suburbs. And so there is that demand for housing. I'd be willing to bet money that the place you're describing is pretty attractive neighborhood. So they're booming, and the same thing's true in the United States. But what's the other side of that? We're depopulating our cities. Cities are the greatest wealth generating phenomena in the history of civilization. I mean, that's what civilization means. It means cities. And so if we're depopulating and draining our wealth creating engine, what does that do to the economy long run? So as an individual choice, it makes sense and I understand it. But the macro effect is we're depopulating these wealth generating places. I mean, just take any downtown area. It could be Melbourne or Adelaide or Sydney or New York for that matter. If there's an attractive downtown office building, let's say you're a large company, insurance company, whatever, and you used to have 10 floors as your corporate headquarters. Well, now everyone's been working from home for almost a year. That's nothing that anyone would have recommended, a year ago. But we were forced to do it, and guess what? It works. Employers and employees are finding that, hey, it works. You can communicate and get stuff done, and maybe there's some attractions to it. So this work from home thing is here to stay. What companies will do, they'll say, well, instead of 10 floors, I only need 2 floors, and I'll have attractive offices, but you'll reserve them. You'll call up and say, hey, I need an office 2 days next week to meet some clients. Done. They'll build locker rooms. They won't be like high school locker rooms. They'll be very attractive. You'll keep your laptop and your sweater and your scarf or whatever in your locker. You'll show up, take your stuff out of your locker. Some receptionist will tell you which office is yours for those 2 days. Set yourself up, meet your clients, go home and work from home. What does that mean? If you cut commercial real estate capacity or utilization by 80%, we'll start with the cleaning crew and the reception, but what about the food trucks, the restaurants, the shopping, the public transportation, drinks after work, on and on and on, all the things that are ancillary to that downtown office location. You cut that by 50 to 80%. What is that doing to your economy? So these are examples. By the way, this will take a year to play out. This is not an overnight thing. So the tenants are not paying rent. If they are, they've called up and negotiated a 50% increase. I have some involvement in commercial real estate, and I see this in real time. So rents are down by perhaps half or all the way to zero if they're not paying. And everyone says, well, landlords are rich. No, they're not. The landlords take the rents, but they have mortgages. So if the tenants aren't paying the landlords can't pay the mortgagee, and that falls on the banks, right? Except the banks are clever. They've securitized it and sold it probably to you and me, right? We have our 401ks like a superannuation fund, but you look in the fund and do you have some commercial real estate REIT or something that Morgan Stanley sold you? Well, maybe you do. And what's inside? No one knows, but take a look. But that ripple effect I just described can take a year to play out. So we haven't seen the end of this. So the bottom line on all this is that interest rates are going up in anticipation of inflation based on handouts. The reality is the handouts are not being spent, they're being saved, which does nothing for inflation. And it's also not sustainable, which is what are you going to do? Hand out a $2 trillion deficit spending package every 6 months? Because that's kind of what we've been doing since last summer. And they keep saying, well, this is the last one. It'll be sustainable. It's not sustainable. It's a handout and people need the money. But if they put it in the bank, which they're doing, this is a classic liquidity trap. So what's going to happen? Yeah. But meanwhile, the interest rates are going up, perhaps for the wrong reason, but they're going up. That's going to slow the economy further. We're already seeing mortgage applications dry up. We're seeing the housing not bubble, but pretty steep increase in residential housing starting to level up. So by, hard to say, but I would say by March or April, this whole thing is going to go in reverse. Everything we just talked about is going to go in reverse. The economy is not going to have the traction. Unemployment is going to remain high. Velocity is going to continue to drop. There's not going to be any inflation. Those interest rates are headwind. They're going to drop and the price of gold is going to shoot up. So my advice to potential gold investors is it's on sale. Go get some right now. It's always better to buy low and sell high. And but I would expect the price to be much higher by mid-year.
I know that you've said this before, or I'm pretty sure you've said this before, that to stimulate an economy, you need to reduce interest rates by somewhere around 3-4% to have an effect. When interest rates are currently at zero, how can you do that? Where do you go from zero?
Well, a couple of things. The short answer is you can't. You in theory, you can go to negative rates, but negative rates don't work. We have experience from the ECB, Sweden, Japan, Switzerland, elsewhere that negative rates don't work. They're negative rates, but they don't. It's not more of the same. Cutting rates from 3% to zero has a beneficial effect, but cutting them from 0 to -1, now you're through the looking glass. You don't get any more pop. You don't get any more bang for the buck. And there are reasons for that, which are as a central bank, what signal are you sending? Well, see, the idea of negative rates is you're going to spend the money, because if I'm going to take it away, you put money in the bank, even at 0, you put money in the bank, you go away for a year, come back, the same amount of money should be there. That's the 0 interest rate. But a negative interest rate, -1%, you put $100,000 in the bank, you go away for a year, you come back, you only have $99,000. Because I took $1,000, that's 1% negative interest. So the idea is, if I'm going to take your money, you're going to spend it fast because you don't want me to take your money. And that's going to have the stimulative effect that we talked about. That's not actually what happens. What happens, two things. Number one, people have lifetime goals. Their retirement, their healthcare, their parents' healthcare, their children's education, buying a house. There's some large lifetime goal you have, and that's why you save money in the first place. If I'm taking your money away, you're going to save more, not less. You still want to achieve that goal. I've made it more difficult, but you're actually going to save more. They want you to spend it, but now you're saving more. And the second thing is, what signal is a central bank sending when they have negative interest rates? They're saying that they're worried about deflation, not inflation, but deflation.
Yeah.
So if they're telling me, if central bank is telling me that deflation is a problem, I'm going to wait. And why should I buy anything right now? Wait till the price drops. And by the way, a negative interest rate, -1%, my example, is a nominal phenomena. But in real terms, if you have deflation, my money is worth more. So even though my dollar amount may be less, my purchasing power went up because prices went down. And so that's why negative interest rates don't work, because A, you're sending a deflation signal, so people defer spending, and B, they have lifetime goals, so they actually save more. So negative rates don't work. So you're right, you're stuck at 0, there you are. Pardon me, you can do QE, you can do quantitative easing. And usually what happens is they hand the ball over, I don't know if it's a rugby match or whatever, but they hand the ball from monetary policy, which is now impotent, to fiscal policy, which is deficit spending. But there you have other kinds of headwinds having to do with very high debt levels. More to the point, in terms of what a central bank can actually do, they can't stimulate. They can print money, and governments can spend money and incur deficit spending. But again, none of it does any good if people don't actually spend it, and that's a psychological phenomenon. And the Fed or the Reserve Bank of Australia or any central bank can print money, no doubt about it, but they can't change people's psychology. We had an external shock, an exogenous shock in the form of the pandemic that caused people to stop spending, save more, or they were unemployed. Or if you're the unemployed individual, you're not taking your friends out for dinner these days. You're putting money in the bank, and even if you still have your job, you're going to save money because you're worried you might be next. You might be the next one to get laid off, or your company might shut down next week or next month. And so you're going to save more. It's what economists call precautionary savings, or, in plain English, saving for a rainy day. And that's what's going on. It's going on all over the world.
And last time I was in Hong Kong, I was giving a speech, very high level. The Asia Society was hosting it. And somebody took me aside and said, Jim, be careful what you say. The sequence is currency wars, trade wars, shooting wars. Shooting wars solve the problem. Mass mobilization warfare, destruction of capital, 50 million dead, very good for the labor market, very good for construction, very good for recovery. Not a great way to get there. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Let's talk a little bit about the trade war. A lot of people say, well, this started in January 2018 because Trump put tariffs on solar panels and appliances, your refrigerators or whatever. Well, yeah, you could say that, but I would say the trade war started in 1994. When China did a maxi devaluation of the yuan, continued through 2001, when they made a bunch of promises to join the WTO, World Trade Organization, and broke every single promise, continued through the early 2000s when they were manipulating the currency, and continued through 2016, where they were admitted to the IMF special drawing right basket of currencies, one of only 5, and lied to the IMF because they said we'd have an open capital account, and they shut the capital account the following year. So what he did in 2018, I view as the U.S. finally got the wake-up call and retaliated. Here's the globalist mantra, and this goes back to the 1990s, and whether it's Richard Haas, Jeffrey Sachs, President Clinton, President Bush, many others, it's a long list of people. They said, look, we understand that Chinese are communists and they're kind of bad actors and they do bad things, but if they're willing to embrace something that looks a little bit like capitalism, they will grow richer. They will grow more sophisticated. The education level will go up. We will accommodate that by letting them join the World Trade Organization and the IMF, even though we know they lie, cheat, steal, because they will eventually get rich enough that they will be just like us. They'll throw off their communist masters, embrace a Western model, and it'll be just like Europe. We're all on the same team, democratic, quasi-socialist, but democratic, capitalist, liberal, in quotation marks, societies, and China will be just like us. That was the theory. I said it was wrong at the time, and time has proved that correct, meaning they're just rich communists. I said the only thing worse than a poor communist is a rich communist. And so we have created rich communists at the expense of our own workers, at the expense of our own economies. They are not like us. They're more communists than ever. Communists, atheists. The human rights violations are incalculable. If you're a Uyghur, maybe a Muslim Uyghur, or a Catholic in China, and you express any dissent at all, you'll be arrested. You'll be put in a concentration camp, indoctrinated with communist philosophy. Maybe you'll get it, maybe you'll fake it, maybe you won't. But for those who apparently don't get it, they're strapped to an operating table without anesthetic, and their organs are removed while they're still alive and sold to the organ tourism industry, this huge multi-billion-dollar transplant industry in China, and then they cremate the bodies. That's real. And what does that sound like? Killing innocent people and cremating the bodies? Have we seen that movie before? So that's who, I don't know why we do business with China at all. So that's who you're dealing with. They're not getting more like us. They've elevated Xi to, first of all, president for life. There used to be this, you got two 5-year terms, and then in your second term, you kind of announced or anointed your successor, who would then pick up the reins at the end of your second 5-year term. That process was, which is driven by consensus, was working very well and giving China a little bit of stability. Xi tore it up. He's in his second 5-year term now, but he did not announce a successor. And at the last National Party Congress, they changed the rules so that he can stay on indefinitely. So he's president for life. They also created something called Xi Thought, which is a big deal because it elevates his ideological musings to the level of Mao thought. He's only the second Chinese leader to get that designation. All the others, okay, you're president of China, head of the Communist Party, whatever, but they were never treated on a par with Mao. Xi is. So we have Xi Thought. We have, gross human rights violations, geopolitical confrontation, near war in the South China Sea, testing the boundaries with India, all the, intellectual property theft, lie, cheat, steal through the economy. Their numbers are fake, by the way. I'm sure you've heard of something called Goodhart's Law. Goodhart's Law says, when a metric becomes the object of policy, it loses meaning as a metric. So in other words, if you compute your GDP honestly, it's valuable information. It tells you what your economy is doing. But the minute you target GDP as a matter of policy, it loses meaning because you're just manipulating to a result. That's what they're doing. And this is a big deal because U.S. companies are watching this now. Apple's although Chinese value added in the iPhone is about 6 or 7%. 100% of the cost of an iPhone is treated as a Chinese export and a U.S. import. But their value added is only about 7%, give or take, because they buy the Gorilla Glass they buy from Germany, the circuits they buy from Japan, they buy other components from South Korea, so they have to pay as much as they get, and then they're just assemblers. These are Lego-style assembly jobs. And don't underestimate the extent of the poor working conditions, slave labor, prisoner labor, some of the things that go into this. Okay. But American companies are getting the wake-up call, they're getting the message, and what they're doing, this is a very big deal, they're moving the supply chain origin to Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and these are 10-year decisions. You don't move your factory from China to Vietnam and then move it back next year if things are good. You keep it there. Again, these are major fixed assets, major long-term investments. So if you move it out, you're not coming back, maybe ever. And so these are permanent losses of jobs to China. and their GDP is overstated, grossly overstated. My adjustment gets them down from, round numbers, from about 6.2% to maybe, a little under 4, 3.8 or so. But I've seen other scholars whose opinion I respect say it's more like 2.5%, and some say 0. Okay. So China is, the growth slowdown is abrupt, it's material, and it's getting worse. And so what'll happen is Xi's status is now at risk. I mean, okay, he may be president for life and Xi thought and all that. He may be the most powerful leader since Mao. But, the Cultural Revolution got a little bit out of control for Mao too. And so the Politburo, they're going to be careful, but they may get rid of Xi at some point. Or you may see social unrest. You may see Hong Kong writ large. And Hong Kong's not going away. That situation's not getting better. Well, first of all, China will invade. They kind of already have. They haven't sent in the People's Liberation Army, but they have an armed paramilitary police force. They're already in there, and they'll do more. The violence will get worse. The social unrest will get worse. I've been gone to Hong Kong for 35 years or more. It's interesting. If you had asked me in the early '80s, and when I first started going to Hong Kong, just describe Hong Kong, I would have said, well, it's the second most vibrant city in the world after New York. New York would always be number one, but nightlife, energy, finance, attitude, everything about Hong Kong was just, amazing. Every time I went back there, and I was there last year, it got worse. It got more subdued, people got more depressed. And then in the 2000s, I could really detect the funk. It's like, we're here, we're working, we're a financial center, but this is no fun. And, we're kind of looking over our backs. And last time I was in Hong Kong, I was giving a speech, very high level. The Asia Society was hosting it. And somebody took me aside and said, Jim, be careful what you say. And I had never heard that before, not in Hong Kong. I mean, someone might have said that in Beijing or Moscow or someplace, but not in Hong Kong. So, and I said what I wanted anyway. I was getting out the next day, but it's bad. Well, it's obviously bad because there are violent demonstrations, and a few people have died, and more may die. But that's going to get worse. That genie's out of the bottle.
Okay. So my forecast, I do update them, but big picture, it goes as follows. So what is Jay Powell doing? First of all, March 1st, 2022, the Fed fund policy rate, interest rates were 0. And we're now at 4.5%. Even in the Volcker days, we never went up 4.5% in 10 months. Not that fast. And so here we are. So what is Powell doing? Well, he's given 5 speeches on the subject. I don't know why Wall Street doesn't listen, but he keeps trying. He said the same thing every time. He said, inflation is job one. We're just going after inflation. Believe us. There is going to be a recession. Unemployment is going to go up. There's going to be pain. I've never heard a Fed chairman use the word pain. He used it 5 times in one paragraph in the Jackson Hole speech. And that's what we're doing. And believe us when we say it.
According to Jim Rickards, a global recession is coming, and it's going to be painful. Unemployment will go up. The economy is slowing down, and the Federal Reserve has already used every single tool that they have. Inflation has come down, but for a really bad reason. We will get into the reason later in the video. There's the myth of something called the terminal rate. Simply put, it's a rate that the Federal Reserve needs to reach so that inflation will come down on its own without further rate hikes. Wall Street said the Fed is already at the terminal rate, so they don't need to raise it anymore. But the Fed is saying no, we haven't reached the terminal rate yet, so we have to keep raising it until we reach the 2% inflation target. So the question is, how long will the Fed keep raising the interest rates? We're already over 5% now, and the Fed's still planning to raise it even more? With the current high interest rate, these tech companies already laying off a lot of their employees because they have to tighten their finances. What if the Fed raises it even more? Let's find out.
Now, how long will he raise rates? How quickly? And what's he trying to do? Powell is trying to get to something that he calls the terminal rate. But the definition of the terminal rate is it's a rate that's high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further hikes. So we'll get to a level, and then inflation is coming down, by the way. And in the last 5 months, it's gone from, in the U.S., it's gone from about 9% to 8.7, 8.2, 7.4, 7.1. So it is coming down. Having said that, the target is 2%. and 7.1 is still a far cry from 2. So he's not there, but he's making progress. So here's I hate to use the word conundrum, but it kind of is. Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are two different things. Right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation is coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think. And rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it. And you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message, why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake.
Jim Rickards said something about the Volcker mistake and why Jerome Powell is still raising the interest rate and not cutting it yet. The famous Fed pivot, as Wall Street calls it. Jay Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake by cutting the interest rates too early and failing to bring inflation down. Do you know why the interest rate was raised to 20% back in the 1980s? It's because of the Volcker mistake. The tale goes as follows. In the late 1970s, inflation was going up a lot, and therefore the interest rates rose from around 4.5% to 10%. But that 5% raise took 3 years, from 1976 to 1979. Meanwhile, the current rate hike that we have now is the fastest in history. We went from 0 to 5.25% in just 1 year. Back in the 80s, we had a recession, and the chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, had to cut the interest rate down by 7%. Not 0.7%, but 7 full percentage points. He cut the interest rate from 17% to around 10%. And after that pivot, he raised it back to 20%. And 3 years later, in 1987, the rates finally came back to normal. Back then, we needed 10 years in order to finally win the inflation fight. And now what? We're expecting it to win in a couple of months? The Fed just raised the rates fastest in history, and people expect to bring it back down? Let's get into the detail.
People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book, just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist. He's a lawyer. So he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won. because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981, 82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder. He never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out?
We learned a lot from Jim about the current situation and what Jerome Powell will be doing. But there's more to that story. Powell doesn't even understand what's going on in the real world, which is inflation itself. There are two sources of inflation, the supply side and the demand side. We are at the supply side inflation, which means the supply of goods is scarce, but the demand is high, and therefore the prices go up. But supply side inflation can transform into demand side inflation, and this is where the dangers begin. People's spending behavior changes, and they're worried that something worse will happen, and then they grab everything they can. And therefore the demand rises, and you got yourself inflation caused by an increase in the demand side. That's what most people don't understand, including Wall Street. Wall Street said inflation will come down on its own because we've reached the terminal rate. But Jerome Powell thinks we are not done yet, and therefore he will raise rates even more. And what does Jim Rickards think? Does he think Powell is at the terminal rate yet?
In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't. If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them, the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing. And that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up and, people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed. And energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side. But by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons. So 90% is the critical threshold. The U.S. is at 131%, highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth, or you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. So the way it works is raise interest rates, tighten money, reduce the balance sheet, et cetera. Get unemployment up. It doesn't sound like a desirable goal, but that's what it takes. And that's what happened in 1982. Get unemployment high enough so people are buying hamburger instead of steak. They're buying, whatever's the least expensive thing on the shelf, day-old bread instead of new bread, or they're not buying gasoline because they're not going to work, et cetera. That will bring prices down, but at a very high cost, which we just talked about, which is high unemployment and lower productivity. Meanwhile, the U.S. debt keeps going up. We haven't really talked about the debt. That part of it looks like 1981. But if you throw in a global financial crisis, then it starts to look more like 2008. Yeah, well, that's like a glacier. Glaciers are extremely powerful, but they move extremely slowly. There's some exceptions, but they kind of like, an inch a year, a couple inches a year, but they move mountains. I mean, they create rivers, they create canyons, they move mountains. They're extremely powerful, but slow. That's a good metaphor for the impact of debt. And when I talk about debt, in particular with the United States, but you can apply this to any country, I focus on the debt to GDP ratio, because you can't really talk about debt in isolation without thinking about the capacity to pay the debt. And a simple example, if you have a $50,000 balance on your credit card and you're making $30,000 a year and trying to pay rent in New York, et cetera, good luck. You're probably going to go bankrupt or at least default on that card. But if you owe $50,000 on your credit card, but you're making $5 million a year, it's, you just write a check. It's no big deal. My point is, you can't look at a $50,000 debt and decide if it's a problem or not unless you compare it to the income. And if it's too low, it's a problem. And if the income is high, not a problem. So that's why you use the debt to GDP ratio. The US just hit $31 trillion in national debt. That is national debt, almost all of it in the form of US Treasury securities. Not all of it, there are other obligations, but mostly US Treasury securities. Well, is that a problem or not? Well, one way to answer the question is compare it to GDP, do the ratio. The answer is that ratio is now a little over 130%. What was it in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected? The answer is 30%. 30% is completely comfortable. That's like the person with the $50,000 debt who's making millions. No big deal. 30% is comfortable. 50%, yeah, getting up there. Angela Merkel and all her years in Germany, and there's a lot of research to back this up, says that 60% was the limit. And that's what the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Union and the European Central Bank, that was their goal. They said, don't go over 60%. If you do, you're expected to take measures, raise taxes or reduce debt or reduce spending, do something to get that back down under 60%. if you say, what's the critical threshold where, water turns to steam, or, water turns to ice, or something changes in such a way that it's not the same. It's radically different, but it happens very quickly. The best research says the answer is 90%. And this comes out of, Ken Rogoff at Harvard, also Carmen Reinhart, who's now the chief economist at the World Bank. But they've looked at hundreds of cases over hundreds of years. And I like that because it's not just, kind of cherry picking data. Developed economies, developing economies, economies that issue debt in their own currencies, ones that issue debt in other currencies, principally US dollars, et cetera. So, a wide variety of case studies. And they show that when your debt to GDP ratio goes over 90%, your multiplier of additional debt goes below 1. So just to put that in context, at 30%, if I borrow $1 and spend $1, I might get $1.30 of growth. Assuming you spend it wisely. That's a big condition. But you borrow $1 and spend $1 and get $1.30 of growth. Okay, the debt was productive if you put it to good use. But that $1.30 gets smaller and smaller. As you get closer to 90%, it goes to $1.20, $1.10, $1.05. Past 90%, roughly, you borrow $1 and you spend $1 and you only get 95 cents of growth. You don't get your dollar back in terms of GDP. And then 90% and 85%, et cetera. So 90% is the critical threshold. The US is at 131%, highest in history, which means we are well past the point where you can borrow your way to growth, or you can borrow your way out of a debt crisis. And we were heading for a debt crisis. Now, Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain of modern monetary theory. She's a professor at State University of New York. She says it doesn't matter. That they always point to Japan. Japan is at 280%, way past any member of the peer group. China's probably higher. China's a little more opaque because they are, but also they don't have as much national debt. If you look at the national debt to GDP, it's modest, but they have an enormous amount of provincial debt, and the banking system is owned by the government or controlled by the government. So when you throw in the bank debt, the state-owned enterprises, the provincial debt, and the government, so that's the real national debt. Stephanie Kelton says, it doesn't matter because you're borrowing in your own currency. So if you're Argentine and you're borrowing dollars and you print pesos, how are you going to pay the dollars back unless you have, huge trade surpluses, which they don't. So they just default. Argentina is a serial defaulter and everyone expects that. If you borrow in dollars and you print dollars, which the United States does, they're like, what's the problem? Just print the dollars and pay the money back. Well, that's true. If you print dollars, there's no reason to default on dollar debt because you actually can print the money and buy the bonds. But it doesn't mean nothing else bad happens. What about inflation or hyperinflation? What about the foreign exchange rate? The exchange rate can collapse. And these modern monetary theorists show very little understanding of the international aspects. They treat the US like a closed economy, which it's not. I mean, if it were a closed economy and we didn't have to worry about trade deficits, trade surpluses, capital flows, exchange rates, foreign credit, China owning $1 trillion of US Treasury securities, which they do. If you didn't have to worry about any of that, I think they'd probably still be wrong, but they'd have a better case. But you do. And they're just not very knowledgeable about any of those things. But you can think of exchange rates as a conveyor belt. Exchange rates are one way the problems go from one country to another, or good things can go from one country to another, depending on whether your exchange rate is going up or down, the impact on terms of trade, et cetera. But they completely ignore all that. They also ignore the role of commercial banks. They just look at the Treasury and the Fed and look at money supply, but like kind of M0, but don't understand how commercial banks create M1 and they do their own thing. They're not on as short a leash as they seem to think. But if you read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, she says, well, we don't really need a bond market, U.S. bond market. We only have a bond market as a favor to investors because it gives them a place to put their money. But why why have, he said, you have government spending. So the Treasury borrows money by issuing bonds, and then the Fed monetizes the bonds by buying the bonds, and that gives the Treasury the money to pay the bills, et cetera. She says, do away with all that. Just give the Fed, wire instructions for Lockheed. And if you need 5 F-35 fighter jets, order them and just send the money right to Lockheed. Why do you need a bond market? I mean, she actually says that. So, okay, legally, that might be possible, but to suggest that you can do that without consequences is nonsense. And then you say, what about inflation? Their view is as long as there's excess capacity and unmet needs, et cetera, you're not going to have inflation because there's a lot of slack in the economy. That's a legitimate debate. But they say when inflation happens, raise taxes. And then, by the way, they also say you don't need a tax system because if you can just print the money, why do you have to collect taxes? And their answer is, we collect taxes to redistribute income. Okay, well, at least they're honest. I mean, that's kind of a socialist model, but they're honest about it. But it's important to bear in mind that Stephanie was the principal economic advisor to Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. And Bernie Sanders today is the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, controls the purse strings. So coming out of Congress, and Biden's kind of a cipher. He's barely aware of his own existence. So Sanders is in a powerful position, and she's the Bernie whisperer, so to speak, who's behind all this. So if you ask the typical member of Congress, can you define modern monetary theory? They'll look at you funny. They've either never heard of it or they certainly don't know what it means, MMT, But they're acting in accordance with modern monetary theory. Whether they know it or not doesn't matter. The actual behavior of the Congress, and again, just go back to COVID 2020, because we talked about the debt to GDP ratio. So in around May or June 2020, Trump put through a $2 trillion COVID relief package, and that was when the Paycheck Protection Plan, that was $800 billion, and everyone got the $1,200 check, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end of December, at the very end of the Trump administration, they did another $1 trillion almost. And that's when everyone got the $600 checks. And now you're up to $1,800. By the way, those checks, that is helicopter money. That's, what the Fed does is kind of nonsense. But when it's fiscal policy, not monetary policy, and you're handing out checks, that is helicopter money. And credit to Larry Summers for saying, you're going to get inflation out of this. Well, Biden comes into office in January 2021, and he's like, not to be outdone, he did his own COVID relief package. That was another $2 trillion. And that's when we all got the $1,400 checks. They just handed them out. And then later that year, or they did the $1 trillion infrastructure package. And then just to top it off, what did we get recently was the just under $1 trillion Green New Deal, or I call it the Green New Scam. Well, and the baseline budget deficit, before everything I just described, the baseline budget deficit was about $1 trillion a year. So take $1 trillion for 2020, 2021, and 2022, add on, $2 trillion for Trump's first package, $1 trillion for his second one, $2 trillion for Biden's first package, $1 trillion for the Green New Scam, and I think $1 trillion for infrastructure. That's $7 trillion on top of the $2 trillion baseline budget deficit. So that's $9 trillion piled on top of what was at the time about a $21 trillion national debt. So that's how we got to 30 trillion. That's how the ratio went from 106 to 131. These numbers are mind-boggling, and MMT says doesn't matter. But it does matter, and it shows up the way I described earlier, which is it slows growth. You don't get growth. So best case for the U.S. is very slow, weak growth, which we saw from 2009 to 2019. Worst case is you throw a recession on top of that, which we're heading for, and the U.S. will be in fiscal distress. The U.S. is heading into recession, and we may be in a recession. Everyone's like, wait a second. Yesterday, GDP was up 5%, and it was. That was the number for it was the first government estimate for the third quarter of 2023. It was up 5%, but it was very heavy on consumption and very heavy on inventory. When wholesalers and distributors build up inventory, that counts as GDP. Well, it's fine to build up inventory if people are buying the stuff, but if they don't buy the stuff and you're up to the rafters in inventory, you got to start writing it down. This is where you see, you go to the Gap and you get like 10 shirts and 5 pairs of jeans for $30. I mean, the inventory situation comes down to the consumer. Are people buying stuff? It looks like the consumer hit the brakes in August. Now, the second quarter is July, August, September. Sometime around mid to late August, after 2 pretty strong months, and they were strong, the consumers just hit the brakes. Now, they've done enough to make the third quarter strong, but going into the fourth quarter, they may just, not show up for the game. A couple of reasons for that. Number one is during the pandemic, you go back to 2020, 2021, what was going on? Well, starting with Trump in, I think, June 2020, he gave everybody a $1,400 check. If you got a heartbeat, you got a check. And then Trump did it again in December 2020, just before he left office. It was another $600 check. Biden comes in and says, well, I can top that. And Biden does in February 2021, right after he was sworn in. Here comes another $1,600 check. And then when people got those checks, they saved a lot of it. So what happened in 2023? People drew down their savings. The savings rate got really low. Like they spent the savings they had. They didn't make new savings. And then they turned to the credit cards and ran up their credit card balances. Well, that feels good for a while. But then if you're paying the minimum and rolling over the balance and you're at your limit, your credit limit's used up, and the interest rates are 20%, some of them are 28%, you're going to double that balance in 3 years. So if you're like, I'll just pay the minimum this month and I'll figure it out, your balance is going up because the interest is compounding faster than you're paying it down at 25%. So people are tapped out on their credit cards. They've used up their savings. They're getting into a deeper hole because the interest is compounding faster than they can pay off the credit cards. And they're just backing away. And it's showing up in things like gasoline consumption. It's way down. The demand for gasoline is what economists call inelastic, meaning you just have to buy it no matter what the price is. You got to take the kids to school or get to work or go shop, whatever it is. You're just going to buy the gasoline even if you don't like the price. By the way, lately prices have been coming down a little bit, which is another, that sounds good, but it's actually a bad sign because it's disinflationary, which kind of leans in the direction of a recession. But for gasoline consumption to drop, forgetting about the price, that means people are not driving. They're not going on vacation. They're not doing road trips. They're not driving any more than they have to. There are a lot of other signs. We don't have time to get into all the technicals with negative swap spreads and inverted yield curves and all the rest. But it does look like the consumer slammed on the brakes around late August, early September. The fourth quarter could be a disaster. The stock market's starting to wake up to that fact. So I would say it's a pretty simple recommendation, Matt. Reduce your exposure to stocks overall. Increase your exposure to cash. It'll give you, you won't lose money on cash, assuming that inflation is not bad, and it'll give you a lot of optionality. You can go, if things get really, really, really bad, if you have cash, you can go shopping and find some bargains. But if you're in stocks and they go bad, you're just going to lose that money and never see it again. But if you do have stocks or some stocks, I would look at energy, defense, not for good reasons. There's enough wars going on, but defense will do well, and mining because gold and silver prices and strategic minerals will do well. So defense, mining, and energy are the sectors I'd be in. I'd lighten up on tech, get out of everything else, go to cash. Treasury notes look attractive here because interest rates are going to start to come down. I know they've been going up. I get it. But it looks like they peaked and have turned around. So treasury notes, a good 2-year note, a 5-year note will perform very well. And they're very safe, obviously. And just take it from there. But you've got to be tuned into the geopolitics to understand the stock market. You can treat them as separate subjects, but if the world's falling apart, so that's not good for stocks. Right. So when we say bond markets, Matt, we have to be careful which bond market. I'm talking about the U.S. Treasury bond market. The short-term treasuries, 4-month bills, 6-month bills, up to 1 year. The funny thing now is that the highest yields in the U.S. Treasury market are in like a 6-month bill. Like, wait a second, shouldn't I get more if I buy a 30-year bond, or shouldn't I get more if I buy a 10-year note? It's a longer maturity, more stuff can happen, inflation, bank freezes. all those things can happen. I want a higher interest rate for my longer term security. That's usually the way the yield curve looks. It's kind of goes, it's upward sloping. The longer the maturity, the higher the rate. That's not true today. The highest maturities are right around 6-month bills, 1-year bills, going out to 2-year notes. When you get to the 10-year note, you actually get a lower interest rate, lower what's called yield to maturity than you do on a 2-year note. The interesting thing about 2 years is you get a high rate, but it's less volatile than a 10-year note. It's more liquid. 10-year notes are pretty liquid, but 2-year notes are very liquid. So you can actually have the best of both worlds. You can have a shorter maturity, which means less risk in some ways, and a higher interest rate. So it's like I said, the best of both worlds. But the highest interest rate is actually from 6 months to 1 year. So those are very, very safe securities, and they're paying like 5.25%, not quite 5.5%, but well, between 5.25% and 5.5% for 6 month, for a 6-month treasury bill. Why wouldn't you just buy one of those? I mean, it's more than what you get in the bank. Now, the answer is, well, yeah, Jim, that sounds good. But if interest rates go up even more, you're going to lose money on your capital. The value of the note or bond will go down if interest rates go up. That's bond math 101. Rates go up, prices go down. The opposite is true. Rates go down, prices go up. So you can make or lose money, but that inverse relationship kind of throws a lot of people, but that's just how it works. So yeah, buying a 2-year note that yields about 5.1%, very liquid, very safe, good return, more than your bank will pay you, more than most stocks will pay you. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, the answer is, if you think the 2-year note is going to go to 6%, you might not like it, because you're going to, if you hold it for 2 years, you'll get your money back. But if you want to sell in the meantime, you're going to have a capital loss on the note itself. So therefore, the next level of analysis is, well, what's going to happen to interest rates? Everybody wants to know that. In my view, they've peaked. They're going to come down. And if you like that action, you might prefer the 10-year note, because a longer maturity has a higher, not to get too technical, it's called DV01, dollar value 1 basis point. What it means is that, so interest rates come down a certain amount, 25 basis points, 50 basis points, or whatever. And I said bond prices go up, which they do. But how much do they go up? Well, the answer is, the longer the maturity, the more they go up. They're more volatile. And so 2-year notes are a really attractive piece of paper, very safe. You get your money back, liquid, you can get out of it, etc. The only reason not to buy would be if you thought rates are going to go up. I think they're coming down from here on out. But if you accept that view, then the 10-year note is going to have the biggest capital gains. Now, again, it's riskier. When I say risky, I'm talking about market risk. I'm not talking about credit risk. You are going to get your money back, but from a market risk point of view, if you had to sell it, a year from now or 6 months from now, for that matter, if rates go up, you're going to lose a little money on the value of the note itself. But if rates come down, not only do you get the 5% interest rate, which is sweet, but you're going to have a capital gain on the note, because that's what happens when rates come down. So the big question is, have rates peaked? And I would say they have. And I base that on what I said earlier about the economy. If we're going into a recession, we're going into a slowdown, we're looking at all kinds of geopolitical risk, stocks are coming down, then interest rates are going to come down too. The debt's not going up at 2% or 3%. The debt's going up 8, 9, 10% or more. The U.S. had a $1 trillion baseline budget deficit, $1 trillion per year deficit for fiscal 2020 pre-pandemic. The Congress threw $3 trillion of emergency aid on top of that. And I'm not even criticizing all those programs. I mean, the payroll protection plan loans, the extended unemployment benefits, the increased unemployment benefits. Imagine where we'd be if we hadn't done that. But that aside, debt is debt. They piled $3 trillion on top. Now, this is going to take the U.S. debt to GDP ratio up to 135%. It was 106% when Donald Trump was sworn in. It's close to 130% today. Because remember, you got two things going on. It's a debt to GDP. So debt's your numerator and GDP is your denominator, right? Well, what happened? Well, the denominator shrank. This got smaller and this got bigger. So what happens to the ratio? It blows up. So now it's 135%. If you get the laws of economics right, which is not easy because most economists don't,
Yeah.
but if you get them right, it's really a reflection of human nature. I mean, what is an economy other than all the people in the economy starting businesses, buying, selling, traveling, providing goods and services, et cetera. So human nature doesn't change, or at least it hasn't changed much in the last 100,000 years. So the fundamental laws of economics don't change either, but circumstances change, facts change, and that's important. Now, to answer your question, Kerry, you're right. There is a school of thought, a growing one, an influential one, that the debt doesn't matter. It's like, well, wait a second. So what? So the debt to GDP ratio went to 135%, which it did. Who cares? Well, what's wrong with it? 180%. We got issues. We got problems. Print up the money and monetize the debt and spend it and keep going. What is the problem? This comes under the banner of something called modern monetary theory, MMT. It's flawed, it's wrong, but it's got its followers, and those followers are now in the White House because one of the things Joe Biden had to do to get elected was to make peace with the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. They take the view that if the Treasury didn't spend the money, how would anybody make any money? That's ridiculous, but that's what they say. They say, hey, when the Treasury spends money, what do? Well, they build aircraft. They have benefit programs. They have government contracts. They do whatever they do. But when the Treasury gives you the money, you take the money and you spend it on somebody else, goods and services, go out to dinner, have subcontractors, whatever it might be. That's the real source of money. They also take the Treasury and the Fed and they merge them. Now, that's not legally the case. The Treasury and the Fed are separate institutions. The Treasury is just part of the executive branch, and the Fed is an independent agency. And the Federal Reserve banks are actually privately owned. That a lot of people know. Some people know that, some people don't. But the Federal Reserve banks are privately owned by banks in the districts, so Citibank, Bank of America, et cetera. So they're completely separate. But the theorists ignore that and say no. The Treasury needs to spend money because that's how the economy grows, and the Fed can monetize the debt. So you spend the money you don't have, you borrow to cover it, you issue bonds to cover the borrowing, and if the market wants to buy the bonds, fine. But if not, the Fed can buy them and put them away on the balance sheet, wait 30 years and collect the money. What's the problem? Who cares about the debt to GDP ratio? It's kind of a statistical abstract, but why should that stand in the way of using money to solve our problems, which are free healthcare, free childcare, free tuition, forgiveness of student loans? That's a $1.6 trillion ticket, by the way. And look, everyday readers and investors, there's no reason they should know all this stuff. This is total inside baseball. You have to be a geek like me to kind of keep up with it, but it's all coming. But what that means is we're going to test the Rogoff-Reinhardt thesis. Now, let me just take a minute to explain that. Up to a certain debt to GDP ratio, there is a Keynesian multiplier greater than 1. So the classic example is the UK was in a depression before the rest of the world. They have been hit pretty hard before the Wall Street crash. People aren't spending, they're saving. It's the liquidity trap. So if you get money, you pay down debt. When you don't have any debt, you put it in the bank. Whatever you do, you don't spend it. You hoard cash. Or people were buying gold. They were accused of hoarding gold, et cetera. But what they weren't doing was spending. And there was a lack of aggregate demand, and the banks were not lending. So Keynes said, well, if everyday people won't do it, the government must. The government can borrow. The government can spend. And what they discovered was that if you borrow $1 and spend $1, you can get $1.50 of GDP. Now, there's a separate debate as to whether that's actually incremental or whether you're just pulling growth forward. But so what? Even if you are pulling growth forward, maybe that's what you need to do when you're in a liquidity trap. But there's a problem. He called it the general theory of employment, interest, and money. But it was actually a special theory. I think he had a little Einstein in me because of the general theory of relativity, but it's actually a special theory, which means it's a theory that works in a set of circumstances, a set of conditions. The conditions where it works are you're either in a recession or just coming out of one. you have excess capacity and labor and industrial capacity, and you have very little debt. In those circumstances, you can borrow $1, spend $1, and get more than $1 GDP. The problem is that extra GDP you get for the borrowing and spending, it goes down as the debt to GDP ratio goes up. What Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered is that at 90%, you go through the looking glass. Your payoff is now less than $1. You borrow $1, you spend $1, and you only get 90 cents of GDP or 95 cents, et cetera. So now, not only are you not getting your dollar's worth for the borrowed dollar or something more, which you did at lower levels, you're getting less than $1. So now what's happening? You're borrowing $1, you're spending $1, you're not getting $1 of GDP, but you are getting $1 of debt, which means your debt to GDP ratio is going up and the 90% is getting worse. And I just mentioned the United States is at 135%. So here are your two competing schools. There's the Keynesian multiplier and creating aggregate demand with government debt, and the Reinhardt-Rogoff, more than a thesis, I would say powerful evidence that beyond 90%, it doesn't work. It goes under less than 1 on the one hand. And my friend Stephanie Kelton and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and the modern monetary theorists who say, no, it's all good. How could you get growth if you didn't spend money through the government? These theories don't agree at all. We're going to find out which ones work. I'll give away the answer, which is that Reinhardt and Rogoff have it right. Keynes had it right up to a point. Reinhardt and Rogoff discovered that critical threshold, that whether you want to call it tipping point or phase transition, or which physicists call it or whatever. The modern monetary theorists think the opposite, and we're going to find out. But what it means if Reinhardt and Rogoff are right, and I'm right, and Keynes was right, the more you borrow, it's actually a headwind to growth. Now you get just as up to the threshold, you got more and more and more. Oh, sorry, at a low level, you got more, but then it went down. But it's like any diminishing marginal return. You know, the curve starts very steeply, you get a lot of payoff, then it flattens out, then it goes down, but it's still positive. But at some point, it goes below the zero line and your marginal return is negative. And that's where we are. So it's one way to pay. People say America has never defaulted on its debt. Well, first of all, that's not true. It's not a true statement. But the easiest, quietest, stealthiest way to default is inflation. It's like, hey, here's your $1 billion back. You know, good luck buying a loaf of bread because I destroyed the value of the dollar. And so now 3%, we'll do it in, do the math, we'll do that in about 22 years. At 10%, you cut the value of the dollar in half in 7 years. By the way, that is what happened between 1977 and 1981. In that 5-year period, the dollar lost over 50% of its purchasing power.
According to Jim Rickards, hyperinflation is coming to America, and the raising of interest rates won't be able to help fight inflation. In fact, it will make inflation even worse. Inflation will impact stock market as Jim Rickards think it will brings the economy into recession, and unemployment will go up to 4 or maybe even 5%. But all Jerome Powell can say is, too bad, that's painful and we have to get there, but we're gonna pay higher prices if we don't. And then there's the myth of 2% inflation. The Federal Reserve have something called inflation targeting, where if they fail to have at least 2% inflation per year, then it means the economy is going into deflation, or to put it simply, the economy is slowing down and therefore unemployment is going to go up and the economy will go into recession. In order to prevent that from happening, the Federal Reserve have to target the inflation to at least 2% per year in order to bring price stability to the market and to keep the economic wheel running smooth. At least that's the theory, but to Jim Rickards it doesn't make any sense. The Fed have raised interest rates way too high, but the inflation is not going down yet. In fact, inflation goes way up even higher than before. People said between 1913 and 2023, the dollar has lost 95% of its value, but we don't need to wait for another 110 years. Jim Rickards explains that in the 1980s, the dollar loses half of its value in just 5 years. Will it do that again? Will the economy goes into recession? Let's find out.
A lot of people like to bang the table and say, you know, since the creation of the Fed in 1913, the dollar has lost 95% of its purchasing power. Well, that's a true statement, but you don't need 110 years. We lost 50% in 5 years between 1977 and 1982. So inflation is insidious. It is a tax. It is a form of theft. But like the kid with the mother's wallet, if you keep the theft, in small little bites, but do it long enough, you can get the whole thing and no one will notice. So they say we want 2% because we want to be able to cut if we have to. But the real reason is we want to basically erode the value of the debt and erode the purchasing power of the dollar in ways that you don't notice. And they can be very patient. That's how they do it. But to your point, Addison, well, hasn't the Fed been raising interest rates? Yes, but real rates are still negative. So if inflation's 9 and the Fed's at 2, the real rate is -7. That's a really, really low interest rate. And if you say, okay, inflation's come down to 6 and the Fed's up to 4, about 4.5 right now. So the real rate is now -1.5 in my example. Well, that's a lot less than 7, but still a negative real rate. We are not in the world of positive real rates. So then the question is, okay, how is the Fed doing at getting inflation to the target? The 2% we talked about, and we explained why that's their number. And this says a lot about what's going on in the stock market right now, because you go all the way back to August 26, 2022. That was Jay Powell's Jackson Hole speech. And he said, inflation's, he didn't use the word out of control, but he said inflation's way too high. We're going to bring it down to our 2% target. We know unemployment's going to go up. We know he will probably have recession. He did not use the R word. He didn't say recession, but he said, growth will suffer, unemployment will go up. That's just a fancy way of saying there's going to be a recession. And we're not going to stop until we get there. And so in other words, too bad, unemployment's going to go up to some number, I don't know what, 4 or 5%, which is pretty high. It's right now it's 3.4, I believe, the lowest since 1969. So unemployment's going to go up. The economy's going to go into recession, but too bad. That's the price we all have to pay to get inflation down under control on the way to 2%. In other words, in the way Jay Powell rationalizes this, he said, yeah, that's painful, and we're going to pay a high price to get there, but we're going to pay a higher price if we don't. If we don't get to 2% and we let this thing spiral out of control and or even stay at 4 or 5% for a prolonged period of time, that the economic damage from that in terms of lost investment, misallocation of capital, basically people losing money on their investments, is going to be much higher than maybe a short recession.
Here's the interesting part. Jerome Powell scares the market with 6 speeches. He said the same thing again and again. We need to get to 2% inflation, which means raising the interest rates even more, and therefore we're going to have a recession and unemployment is going to go up. With the Fed being hawkish, the market should go down. Instead, the market got rallied because they believe inflation is going to go down soon. Jim Rickards thinks the Fed is already reached at something called the terminal rate, a rate which inflation will go down on its own, so the Fed won't need to raise the interest rates any further. But the Fed keeps raising it and making the economy crash even further. So how is it going to end? When will the Fed needs to stop raising interest rates? Let's listen to what Jim Rickards have to say.
So he says that the market didn't believe him. The market rallied, went down a little bit right around that time, but then the market rallied in October. And he comes out at the end of September, he gives another speech at an FOMC meeting, comes out November 2nd, gives another speech, comes out November 30th, gives a speech at the Brookings Institution, and then comes out in mid-December with another speech, and then again a couple of weeks ago on February 1st. So it's like 6 speeches in about 5 months. And he said the same thing every time. He said, we're getting to 2%. Believe me when I said, we're going to have a recession. Unemployment's going to go up. Too bad. We have a lot of work to do. We're not done. The market has flipped on and off. Half the time the market doesn't believe me. Go, yeah, you say that. But in fact, inflation is coming down faster than you thought. You're probably, I should introduce a concept. I guess a lot of people have heard of it, but there's this new concept called the terminal rate. The Fed's trying to get to the terminal rate. And so what's the terminal rate? Well, no one actually knows what the number is. I don't know, but neither does Jay Powell. But it's a theory. And the theory is, okay, the terminal rate is a rate set by the Fed that's high enough to bring inflation down without further rate hikes. We get to a level, and that level is high enough that inflation will come down on its own just by waiting without raising the rate again. And The conundrum, I hate to use that word, but it is a conundrum. The conundrum the Fed faces right now is they have been raising rates and inflation has been coming down. Those two things are true. But is inflation coming down because they're raising rates? In which case, maybe you want to keep raising them. Or are you already at the terminal rate? It's coming down on its own. And now the danger is you're going to go too far. And that's the debate with Wall Street. And so Wall Street is sort of leaning to the view, now you're probably already at the terminal rate. Inflation is coming down. You need to back off. You need to stop and probably pivot. This was the famous word for the last 6 months. The pivot means you're actually going to have to cut rates because you have gone too far and you're going to cause a pretty bad recession. And so the expectation as recently as December was that the Fed would pivot around March or April. They would raise in February, maybe March. But pretty quickly after that, they would cut rates. And if the Fed's cutting rates, buy stocks. It's typical Wall Street analysis. It always ends with buy stocks, particularly tech stocks.
So, with the current high interest rates environment and reckless government spending, what should we do to protect our money from inflation? Should we buy stocks? And what stocks should we buy? The Fed said it will raise the interest rates even further, but the market thinks the opposite will happen. So who's right and wrong here? Let's hear what Jim Rickards think. Spoiler alert. This is not investment advice.
But the Fed has been saying the opposite. So there's been this battle where Powell goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 speeches, says the same thing. We're not stopping. And Wall Street says, oh, yes, you are. So buy stocks. Well, who's right? Well, there's an old saying on Wall Street, don't fight the Fed. I don't think of it as who's right or wrong. You could have an opinion. The way I think of it is I just want to know what you're going to do. Because if I know what you're going to do, then you can trade accordingly. You can plan for that and you can prepare for it. And what they're going to do is they're going to keep raising rates. Even if they're at the terminal rate already, I think they might be. Even if they are, they don't think so. Their opinion counts for a lot more than mine. And they're going to keep going. But by the time inflation comes down enough to say, yeah, okay, we're at the terminal rate, nice job, it'll be too late. They will have gone too far because the Fed's always the last to know.